Okay, so this is about storytelling as an incident management skill. And depending on how much time you've thought about storytelling, how much time you've spent thinking about storytelling, what your sort of association with it is, you might be thinking, I'm going to be talking about this. This is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. He likes to tell people that, or liked to tell people that this is how stories go. I am not talking about this. This is not storytelling. I actually want to talk about something that I think is a much more fundamental storytelling skill, which is how to compose and communicate a narrative that contains an ordered series of events. It's about the logic of how things are connected by cause and effect. A well-constructed narrative of an outage both makes more sense to whoever you're communicating with, and it can help you better analyze the logic of your system and how your system is failing. That's the fundamental skill of storytelling that I want to be talking about here. So here is an example of a narrative that we might create about an incident. We've got 3 services. We have our A, B, and C services. A produces data, B deduplicates, C then consumes this deduplicated data, right? The first thing that I've done here is set the scene of my story. Here's some services, here's how they function, here's how they interact with each other. Then in my story, we have an event. The C service stops getting data. But importantly, this event isn't actually the first element in the logical chain. What I'm going to do to tell my story is extend backwards in time to look for our logical progression. In this case, that means that we're going to go up the call stack. First from C up to, there we go. First from C up to an issue in the B service, and seeing that a limited issue in the B service had some kind of global impact. And now I want to explain why was it a global impact. In this case, particular behavior of the service. You can see how what I'm doing is building a logical progression of the actual incident. What's our story? What's the cause and effect inside of our system and within the setting of our services? And again, now we can go back forward in time now that we've sort of seen a problem. In time and logic, what are we going to do about it? Both in the short term, we mitigate it by scaling up, and in the long term, how are we going to prevent recurrences by fixing the failure modes in our system? This is not a great story if what you're doing is trying to publish fiction, right? There's no characters here. It does have action, right? It's somewhat in the active voice. We did things, incident responders. There are other ways we can order this story. We could add more detail depending on the audience. The important thing, though, is that I'm focusing on the logical progression of events inside the system. So here's that same story, and you might have seen this one before. I'm going to start exactly the same way. This is the same incident. I'm setting the scene. Here's what my services do. And instead of starting with what happened to the system, I'm going to start with what people did. They got paged. And now our narrative continues by following what did our incident responders do? And what did we do next? And what did we do next? There's no structure here explaining the logic of events. We did this, we did this. Why did we take any particular action? Why did any given action help or not help? What's happening to our actual system, either to cause the incident or to cause recovery? As a very attentive reader who already knows things about this system and knows lots of things about this system, like I read postmortems like this, and sometimes I can work out what actually happened inside. But it's really hard to read a story like this and figure out what to do to get better at running this system. The best thing that you can kind of take away from this narrative is that in order to do better at this incident, we should get better at troubleshooting. Because all I have the story of is what was the troubleshooting that we did. And again, by sort of conventions of fictional stories, this is a better story. Humans drive the action, right? It's in the active voice. But that logic of what's happening in the story is missing, and that's actually the narrative that you want within your incident storytelling. You can still, so do not tell this story. Let me be clear, it's on the slide. Don't tell them this way, these are bad. But you can tell the story of your troubleshooting and make it a logical narrative. You can tell the story this way, but logically. What you want to do is lay out the data that you saw at a given point, what hypotheses that led you to, and then what action you took, what were the results of that action, how did you explain the results of that action and modify your hypotheses. It's going to take longer. It's going to be a little bit less crisp for your audience than just telling the narrative of what happened in the story. What happened in the system, excuse me. But it's a useful technique if you want to emphasize why it was hard to come to the right mitigation. So for example, if you have an incident where one of the things that you think is really important is that troubleshooting was really hard, That's a useful thing to include in your postmortem. Or the other time I really like to use that technique is when I'm in the middle of the incident and I'm trying to bring people up to speed on it. So once again, same incident, but this is how I might tell the story in the middle of the incident as I'm adding responders. So I don't actually start with the setting. Sometimes I'll have drawn an architecture diagram for myself. Maybe it'll be up on a whiteboard somewhere if I've got a war room. But the first thing I'm going to say is, why am I here, right? Establishing kind of what these services do and what we understand about them is something that we would do before the incident, not during it. It's just not time. But I do say, why am I here, right? What's going on? Based on the initial page, what's my first hypothesis? Maybe in this case, my first hypothesis was that the C service was overloaded. Based on that hypothesis, what did I do? I scaled up, right? And then I have a result. Didn't fix it. So I must reject that hypothesis, right? I don't actually necessarily say that, but that logic is clear to my listeners. And if my listeners are less familiar with the system, are more junior engineers, seem a little lost, I would draw that logic out directly, right? I scaled up, it didn't help, it must not be that the service is overloaded. Okay, so let's look at some more telemetry and do some more investigation. A new hypothesis. Maybe the problem is upstream, right? And we see that one pod is ooming upstream, and we take an action, right? One pod was ooming and crashing, so we tried to upscale that pod. Crashing stopped. Great, right? That's an improvement, but it's not fixed. Notice again that I'm showing the logic of how this action became a behavior in the system. So again, we don't have to belabor every point, right? Our audience is smart engineers, but explaining what we did helps people see what is and isn't happening. Given that what we did was took an action to prevent the ooming, now what we need to do is figure out why, now that the ooming has been stopped, things aren't better, right? In this case, right, maybe we can then draw on, so the A services still suck. We can show a graph that shows that. We can draw on that knowledge of our service and understand that maybe A doesn't write to B unless all of B's pods are up. And so we restarted A to get it to resend stuck messages, right? That could be a handoff that I might give in the middle of an incident or as I'm bringing on someone else to help me with the troubleshooting further. So that's the concept of a narrative as part of an incident. I hope you can see why having these is really helpful, right? New actions, the next thing to do, falls out of this logic much more obviously than if all you're doing is saying what troubleshooting you've tried so far. If what you do is pause, not necessarily belabor it, but try to say, why did I do this thing and what results did I see? It's somewhat more obvious what you might try next. So there are some other places that we use storytelling in our incident management. One of those places is, as I mentioned before we have an incident, what does our system do? Let's share the setting of what that looks like. We were talking yesterday about models and how models are a way of perceiving what your systems do. I think of that as a storytelling. A model is a simple story that you tell. It also tells us things like, when should we be paged? What does our system accomplish? What is it supposed to do? And it begins to prepare us for that diagnostic. You can also think of a good SLO as a more formal description of what does our system do. Making sure that everyone on your team has a similar picture of what that system does and how, including how it breaks, also speeds up your communication during an incident because you can share the same assumptions without necessarily having to call them out. On-call prep is also a place where we tell stories, and these are slightly different stories that I like to tell about on-call prep. Instead of sharing stories about what happened in systems, we like to share emotional stories about our on-call experience. What does it feel like to get paged? As a way of building empathy with each other. Rather than being about a logical progression, right, these are about feelings. We want to share these feelings, we want to normalize them, we want to say that it's okay to be afraid to be on call, and also you're going to be okay when you are on call. I also use them to remind people that it sucks to get paged, and while it's okay to page people, maybe think for a second before you do it about whether this is really an emergency, because it sucks to get paged. Good prompts, if you're trying to get people to tell stories like this, include things like, what's the most scared you've ever been during an incident? And what's the worst thing you've ever broken? And then what happened? A final way that I use storytelling in on-call preparation is supporting a really good Wheel of Misfortune exercises. So for folks, if anybody's not familiar, Wheel of Misfortune exercise, the most nerdy kind of D&D you can play. You're not even pretending to be an elf, you're pretending to be an SRE. Just saying. But if you understand an incident, right? So for those who aren't familiar, you all sit around a table, you walk through an existing incident. If what you do is understand the narrative of something that you've been paged for, then you need no further preparation to run a great Wheel of Misfortune. You just show up, you say, hey, last week I got paged, you're gonna get paged for the same thing, here's the thing I got paged for, and even when your victim, your teammate, excuse me, when your teammate walks through the incident in a different way than you did, because you know the story of how your system behaved, you understand the logic of how everything was working together, you can just run that Wheel of Misfortune without having to kind of fall back and say, well, I didn't do that, so I'm not sure what would happen if you did that, right? You can use, again, that model, that story of your incident in order to just run the Wheel of Misfortune naturally. By the way, this is a great learning exercise. I was talking to someone yesterday who framed this as everyone has something to teach, everyone has something to learn. As the person who got this page, watching how your team would have done the troubleshooting differently from you is a phenomenal learning exercise. Okay, so that's during an incident. Sorry, that's before an incident. Let me talk about during an incident. So storytelling also supports incident mitigation and resolution by helping us see the logic of failure. Incident communication is sort of a collaborative storytelling exercise. The group of responders is aiming to explain together the logical progression through a system of some trigger. So focusing on that logical narrative, in particular questions like why would A lead to B? Why would this behavior lead to this effect? Can help unstick responders who aren't sure how to remediate during an incident. If I've got a group of responders and I don't know anything about their system, but they're clearly stuck, I just start asking them, why do you think it might do that? What are reasons it could happen? Why did you take this action? Tell me what's normal for this system. Just start to tell me some stories. So let me talk about a real incident. We at Datadog have a pipeline, we have a lot of pipelines, that takes in customer data, it performs various transformations, including some specified by customers via regular expression, and eventually it writes that data for querying. And an engineer was paged because this pipeline was lagging. Initially, only one pod seemed to be stuck, so the responder directed traffic away from that pod. Didn't help, lag continued to increase. And the engineer basically found themselves at a loss because they didn't really have an explanation for what could be causing the lag. It was just one pod was sad, I directed away from the pod, now it's happening. And so we sat down, we talked about some hypotheses. Is the problem perhaps reading from our Kafka instance? Is it writing downstream? Is it something else? And we talked about how the pipeline itself works. In this case, every service reads from Kafka up to a certain number of bytes, and it will pause for the reads until it can commit results downstream. No results were being committed by the affected pods, and if we then went and looked at those affected pods, CPUs completely utilized on them. We found that there was a bad regular expression causing issues, delaying processing, and with that information, it was very easy to mitigate the trigger. Another real incident, right, that involves the question of checking our assumptions. So we have a query system. It reads and filters data from file storage. It's got some layers of caching. And the team implemented a change to read files only once, and then to multicast that file that's been read only once to many processors to save on network and read costs. Has the impact that some queries now cause memory overloads, because when you have a query that needed to read the same file many, many times, all of the instances of that query start running all at once when the file gets streamed over the network. So the team had an incident where the cache layers were running out of memory, and they assumed it was this usual pattern. Queries with many results are causing overload because of the files processing in parallel. Scaling up the cache didn't help for this incident at all. Responders used their well-understood story of how the parallel file processing led to overload to then check each of those assumptions. Are the errors in our cache layer? Is it in the service behind the cache? Are we reading particularly large files? Are we processing especially parallel queries? And in this case found that instead of data being read and over-parallelized, there was a pathologically large query being run by some automation, which again could be blocked. In this particular case, once again, one of those, we need to block the actual query. And finally, after an incident, you can use storytelling to build the most engaging possible postmortem. because there is no point to writing a postmortem that people don't read, and if your postmortem is engaging, a lot more people will read it. We can't solve the problem in the long term unless we really understand the progression of how the system broke, right? We also want to really understand what broke and write good action items. So here's the outline of how I think about writing a good engaging postmortem. Number one, we set a scene, right? Just like if you were telling a story. Share the services that are involved, what they do, and how they function. This is a good place to introduce some introduction to kind of the local operating conditions of the team. This is things like, the team has seen this monitor generate a lot of false positives, or most team members are new to this service. Those are important context for your reader to understand what the story of this particular outage was. We have a setting. Add some drama. Really, genuinely, put drama in your postmortems. They can be cool. Two kinds of drama, right? You can either share the impact from the incident, drama because it affects your customers. We were paged because users couldn't load the website. Or, and this is the one that I actually prefer, discuss an underlying flaw in the service. Do some foreshadowing. Unbeknownst to us, the foo service has the property that attempting to post rickrolls causes pods to crash. Or, when we originally built this service, we isolated each customer to their own shard. We knew this had a chance to cause hotspotting, but at the time thought the risk was minimal. Right? These are dramatic foreshadowing. Put them in your postmortems. This is actually both useful context and makes your postmortem much more interesting to read. And I very much prefer that second option of foreshadowing, because when I start my story with what I got paged for, I'm really tempted to tell the story of how the troubleshooting itself went, instead of the story of the service. So the next piece of an engaging postmortem, lay out that logical narrative, right? We've added some drama. People know where you're kind of going with this. Talk through the trigger. This happened, here's what that caused within our service. Each of those cause and effects. One logical progression at a time. It is important to document how we responded in a lot of incidents, right? I mentioned this earlier. The fact that we run into red herrings and cul-de-sacs, the fact that responses we took did or did not help, and why those responses were logical. It's useful to document those because one of the things that we do is get better at troubleshooting over time. It is to fix our operational and mitigation tools. And so you do want to document those. But for my money, if I'm only going to get one, I want to know what happened in your system, not what happened in your response. Because I can't fix the humans. We can maybe fix the systems. And then finally, all good postmortems end with action items. I want to once again reflect. Hopefully you've seen this. It's a short talk. I can talk more about how the logic helps you see these things. Also see yesterday's modeling talk if you want to think more about how the logic will help you see these things. But seeing that logical progression of what happened in the system makes it so much easier to see what action items can actually prevent your incident in the future. Every link in that chain of events is something that you can address in a systemic way rather than having to think only about your troubleshooting. Otherwise, we're really just stuck trying to prevent triggers or troubleshoot better. With that logical progression, we can build better systems over time. And that's it.